All right, welcome everybody to the first webinar in the succession planning series. So this is hosted by Cooperation Works, which is the national network of cooperative developers. We have co-op development centers and individual members all over the country providing technical assistance, business support, training, and education to groups starting new cooperatives. And this webinar series we'll have a few more planned throughout the year, but it's basically looking at how different co-op development centers have gone through a leadership succession process. And today we are starting with Food Co-op Initiative, which had a leadership succession process over the last couple of years. So they've gone through it. They are an example of planned succession, as you'll hear today. So plenty of notice from the outgoing executive director, a really great process in place planned by the board, and then also an onboarding plan for the incoming executive director. And you'll hear from all three of those elements today. So we have Stuart Reed with us today, who's the founding executive director of Food Co-op Initiative. He was there for, I believe, about 17 years, if I'm remembering that correctly, and stepped back. He nodded his head a time. He's like, almost. And he stepped back at the end of 2022. And Faye Mack stepped in as the incoming, now fairly settled, I think, executive director, has had over a year of onboarding, has set a new strategic plan with the organization. And of course, we're also joined by board member Richard Dines, who has been a longtime board member with Food Co-op Initiative and was a present and active person planning that succession process. So we hope you learn a lot from this. I know that within the CW network and more broadly, we have a lot of centers that either have recently undergone a leadership transition or are probably looking at doing that in the next 5 years or so, maybe less. Maybe you're considering that for your own center. So we hope that this is informative, enlightening, and really helps centers that are looking at succession plan for success and form a smooth process. So without further ado, I am going to hand it over to the folks at Food Co-op Initiative to take us in.
All right, thanks, Alex. I'm Stuart Reed. I get to play the role of the departing executive director, and it's great to see a lot of friendly faces, familiar faces here. And I just want to point out that the people that aren't here are the ones that need to be, because they're not thinking about succession planning, at least not enough to be here today. So whoever's doing the slides, we can go to the next one. There we go. Thank you. All right, so this is just a real brief overview of how we got to where we were at the time of the transition. Most of you know a little bit about us since we've been pretty active with the Cooperation Works Network, maybe a couple of newer people, not as much. But we got started in 2005 as Food Co-op 500. It was a few very visionary organizations that said, we got to do something about these people that keep calling, wanting to start co-ops. There's got to be a better way than just telling them to talk to their nearest co-op and good luck. So they designed a pilot project, and the belief that with the right help, we could get co-ops open more quickly and with higher levels of success. So they started out in that very first year with a series of seed grants and some volunteer groups that provided support to the people that got the seed grants in particular. And that was done almost entirely with volunteer work and allocated time. Richard Dines being the person that was coordinating a lot of that, who's now on our board. Or I'm going to talk like I'm still at FCI. I apologize if that bothers anybody, but I still think of it as being part of it. So Richard is our board chair, or has been for a few years, and has come full circle from that very founding role to helping to lead the organization. And that's, we've jumped ahead to past 2010. We had a kind of a crisis at that point where some of the original funders had some cash flow issues. That was part of the great banking recession and other things happening around then. So we had have to make call out to Alan Gallant, who was on our board at that time, huge supporter. He was the chair of the Blooming Prairie Foundation, and it convinced them to make $1 million investment over 5 years to ensure that we could keep going. And in order to do that, it became logical for us to formally incorporate. We became a nonprofit. I became an executive director instead of a contract worker. And we went forward from there and renamed the organization Food Co-op Initiative. That's where we are today. Okay, next. There we go. I guess I'm doing the timeline too. So anyway, by the time we get to 2022, we had 3 full-time staff. They'd all been around for a while. We were pretty well, we'd gotten used to our roles. We were pumping out work like nobody's business. We've served over 100 startup co-ops, some very hands-on, some, just here's some great information, call us when you need help. We started transitioning away from doing as many on-site visits and work with our, we don't call them clients usually because they don't pay us directly. All of our work with the startup co-ops was done at no charge, unless they requested a special visit and made a donation to help cover costs. All of it was covered by our funding. And so we had to cut back a little on travel, and with COVID in particular, that made it, we concentrated on our online offerings and our remote offerings, Zooming, et cetera. And that went surprisingly well. Some of our online work really took off, including the group calls. And we had about 60% of the budget with stable funding from multiple year grants, or the assumption at least that we would continue to see USDA funding. And that was always a good 40% of our funding came from RCDG. Just to put in perspective how vulnerable I think we could be in the budget area. And I don't think that's changed dramatically yet, although I know it's a priority to try to diversify funding. So a lot of successful groups, our peer calling groups, monthly group calls with other co-ops that help really inspire people and keep them engaged. The up and coming conference, which I hope you've all gone to, and if you haven't, you can go this year. It's going to be a great one in Kalamazoo, Michigan. I had been around since about 2006, so then, let's say 16 years, just to be on the safe side. And I'd known for a few years, I've been thinking for a few years about when I would want to retire and what was the best for me and the organization. And a couple of things, it worked well for my timing with my own personal finances, and it looked like a good time for a transition for FCI. We're as stable as we were going to be, and I felt that it was time for fresh blood, that I wasn't sure that I could continue to give as much of myself as I had in the past. I wasn't going to give up if I stayed by any means, but I just recognized that there's time when somebody else could come in and take us the next step forward. So I'd made it known to the board even before I gave official notice that such thoughts were percolating. So it was not a surprise when I did give a formal notice, and I gave as much as almost a year out because I really wanted the board to have time to do a thorough process. So at that point, while we were thinking, the board and staff were thinking about a new strategic plan that would look at possible changes in direction, we put that on hold until a new manager could come on board and have input into that, or I should say executive director, not manager.
All right. I think this is where I pick it up, right, Stuart?
Yep, it's all yours, Richard.
Okay, thanks. So I'm Richard Dines, and my day job is I work for America's Credit Unions, which for many years was CUNA, Credit Union National Association. And as you heard Stuart say, I was an initial staff person working with NCB, National Cooperative Bank, to help get Food Co-op 500 off the ground. Was actually part of a team that hired Stuart initially as a contract person, and then in 2009 I went to work for CUNA, and then was fortunate to come back in 2015 to serve on the board. I served on the as board chair for a few years, including through 2022 and last year, 2023. The current chair is Darnell Adams. And so, yeah, so going back to 2022 now, Stuart notified the board as early as March that he was retiring. As he said, he did give us kind of hints before that, which at least mentally prepared folks for his notice, his announcement. So that was really helpful. And then, of course, that the long time frame he gave us to hopefully hire someone who could overlap with the end of his tenure, so that there would be some handover time, some onboarding time. That was also very helpful. So in April, we had a regularly scheduled board meeting. So it was good timing for us to be able to talk in person about the leadership transition. We formed a committee, and we had already started a strategic planning process, and we decided to put that on pause while we brought on a new executive director, so that we could re-engage with that process with the new person in place. Beginning in May, that leadership transition committee had drafted and got approved by the full board a timeline, sort of putting into place milestones we wanted to hit along the way to get us to hiring a new executive director, hopefully around the October timeframe, to have a couple months of overlap with the end of Stuart's tenure, and we pretty much kept to that timeline, and we're pretty good about getting where we needed to get to before the end of the year. So in June, we had made a connection through Rich LaRochelle, who's on our board. Hopefully, a lot of you know Rich. Rich is a longtime co-op hero, co-op Hall of Fame inductee, wonderful guy who actually was a leader in starting a food co-op in Fredericksburg, Virginia. And he, at the time, he may still be, he was chair of the Cooperative Development Foundation, which has a close relationship with the National Cooperative Business Association, NCBA. And so he had been talking to folks at NCBA who reached out to us and said, hey, we'd be willing to serve as a consultant and help you with the whole hiring process, the onboarding process, as a consultant, free of charge. Because what we want to do is we want to see how we can do this with a co-op organization, and then be able to market their services to other co-ops for a fee. So we were very, very fortunate to be on the receiving end of that benefit, and the committee and then the full board approved working with NCBA, and they helped us draft, and then the board approved a job announcement, which kind of laid out the position description and sort of how we wanted to frame the job to attract the kind of candidates we wanted to attract. So that was an involved process. It was not quick, but I think we ended up with a great product. And in June, NCBA helped us distribute that job announcement. Members of the board also sent out the announcement through their networks, and we began to receive applications. And initially, the application deadline was August 15th. Actually, no, I misspoke. It was earlier in August. I don't remember the exact date, but I think it was August 5th. And the timing of that application deadline was a week before we had planned to have our staff and board annual strategic planning retreat. So we wanted to plan that so that we had applications in hand, and we were at a good point in our process where when we met in person, we could talk in person about what next steps we would take in the process at that point. So the timing was working out really well, so that we had a time when the board would be able to meet in person. Keep in mind, I guess I should have mentioned this, the Food Co-op Initiative Board is made up of members who are dispersed throughout the country. So we don't typically meet in person. And in fact, we always plan, well, we're not always, but we have been recently at least planning our annual strategic planning retreat in conjunction with the up and coming Food Co-op conference. Because that was an event where most of the board was going to be attending in person anyway. So NCBA, step back for a sec, sorry. NCBA was receiving the applications. They were screening candidates as they came in, making notes on the applicants, and making recommendations and forwarding that on to the Leadership Transition Committee. They also helped set up and they participated in interviews. And then at the end of the process, they assisted with putting together the offer letter as well. All right, thanks, Faye. So in July, that job announcement was sent out through NCBA's own network. Cooperation Works helped out getting the word out. Appreciate that help, and other networks. And there it is. The application deadline was August 5th. And then in August, we all met in person, and we were able to then, talk about it. What we had then as our applicant pool, we were able to talk about that in person. And what we decided at that point was we wanted to extend the application deadline. The board and staff felt that we had a good applicant pool at that point. We were happy with it, but we wanted to make additional extra efforts to try to get the word out even more broadly, increase the diversity of the applicant pool, and just do a little bit more work to try to make sure we had the best possible applicant pool. The Leadership Transition Committee met remotely after that retreat, and we planned out our interview process. And we also decided at that point we wanted to make sure that staff was participating in that process as well. So we invited, there were two staff members at the time, in addition to Stuart. We invited one of those staff members to participate in the first round of interviews, and the other staff person to participate in the second round. And so then Labor Day weekend was a fast and furious exchange of emails to approve questions that we would ask during the interviews, how we would rank those different criteria for evaluating the candidates, and setting up that first round of interviews. So then, as soon after Labor Day as we could schedule them, we had a first round of interviews, and we decided to invite 6 candidates to that first round of interviews. Each interview panel included 3 board members, as well as the staff member I had mentioned. And then from those 6, we then did a second round of interview with 3 of the candidates. And again, we had 3 board members and 1 staff member participating in each of those interviews. And then end of September. Next
Can
slide.
I add something, Richard, before
Oh,
you go on
please
to the
do.
next
Yes.
slide? So one thing I just want to call out about that I think, I wasn't in the process, obviously, at that point, so I applaud the board and staff for this, is that when they decided to extend the application deadline, they also adjusted the job description. What they were hoping to do was to be able to reach people like me who maybe had never started a food co-op or been really ingrained as a co-op development expert, and look for folks who might have more experience in organizational leadership and strategic work, less about the actual program work of the organization. And so they adjusted the language to really explicitly welcome people who weren't co-op developers to the application process, which I had the result of a lot of folks applying who wouldn't have seen themselves in that. It helped it be a much more expansive and welcoming application. And I think it's hard when you're in the middle of the process to be willing to adjust your framing or adjust your language. And they did, and that was when I found the application, when a lot of other people did. So I just wanted to call that piece out.
Great, thank you. Yeah. And then by October, we were very happy to extend an offer to Faye. We, as I mentioned earlier, we put together an offer letter with NCBA as our consultant. So we're very fortunate to have some help with that process, especially since not only are all the board members kind of dispersed around the country, but this is typically a volunteer assignment in addition to whatever full-time job they have. So we didn't have a whole lot of capacity to do kind of the legal work and all the other work that was required. So NCBA really was a godsend in that. We extended the offer letter. Faye accepted. We had a couple of opportunities to actually have Faye meet the board members, and Faye agreed to start on November 21st, which, if I remember right, was the day before our 4th quarter regularly scheduled board meeting. So the board meeting was the day after she had started. So it was kind of a trial by fire there. And Stuart was still working till the end of the year. So there was some overlap time there, about a month and a half, when Stuart and Faye were able to work together on handing off everything and downloading all the information. And I should also mention that earlier in the year, Stuart had already put together an onboarding plan, which the board had also approved. So we already had a plan in place, and Stuart was able to execute on that plan. And in December, Faye and Stuart were able to meet in person. So that was an important opportunity for them to be able to do that handoff. And we had a farewell celebration for Stuart, and his last day was at the end of the year. And that's the whole down and dirty process. And I guess we're going to take questions at the end. Is that right?
I think there'll be a longer sort of extended Q&A at the end, but
Right.
this might be one of the pause moments to see if there have been any questions people have been holding with bated breath up to this moment.
Sure.
All right.
Okay.
Doesn't seem like there's any urgent questions right now, so I think we can continue on.
All right, so I guess now it's my turn to talk again, and I'm going to sort of talk about the transition from my perspective, going a little deeper into my own role as opposed to the board's. And this basically the timeline process breaks down into setting up a timeline, which was done with the board. The board had more input into that probably than I did, but I was able to, include, well, these are issues and events and things happening, so let's work around that. But together we came up with a timeline for that transition. And, we didn't stick to it entirely, but we got there by the end of the year like we intended. So I think that's about as good as you can hope for with the timeline. The second piece that the board asked me to help with was preparing an onboarding plan. Well, I had never done a formal onboarding plan for an executive director before, and I'm a firm believer in not reinventing the wheel. So I did a lot of online research, and it turns out that there's a ton of onboarding plans out there for nonprofit organizations. And there's absolutely zero out there for nonprofit cooperative development centers. So using the ones that I could find, I culled it down to a few that I thought made the most sense, and then consolidated those into one that used the parts that were most relevant for us and that I thought were important. And I certainly learned a lot, and it changed the way I thought about how the process would work by going through that research. So it's definitely worthwhile, and I think we're going to be able to share our onboarding plan, at least a summary version of it, as part of this webinar, so you can see how the process that we were looking at. It has roles specifically for the board, for the executive director, for the staff, and for the incoming ED, and sometimes for multiple parties to accomplish any given step along the way. The board approved that, and then the planning and preparation for the actual onboarding really got underway, which was collecting documents, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, which I'll go into in more detail. And then the board had me leading most of the work with the onboarding. A lot of it, of course, was operational, so that was the way it had to be and needed to be. There was certainly a lot of time the board spent also onboarding in terms of their role and relationship with FAA and their expectations. So there was all of this going on at the same time. Okay, next. Now, I will say, this is kind of going back to the last slide. If you're a small organization, your executive director is doing more than just administrative work. There's a lot of time you're going to need to put into this. And I do mean a lot, and it needs to start early, because you'd be surprised at how long it takes to do something relatively simple like converting a Facebook account to a new owner, if it's even possible. So think about that, especially if you're planning a succession. That ED is going to need extra time, or the staff are going to have to kick in somewhere they may not have before. All right, so information transfer, one of the many critical tasks that has to happen. Again, being a smaller organization, and one that for a long time I was the only person being paid to help keep it running. Almost everything was in my under my responsibilities. We've never had really an administrative position in the organization. So the transfer of information was extensive, and these, the list here is self-explanatory, I think. Contact lists, we didn't go through every contact, but I tried to make sure that the comprehensive contact list was available. Because we use a database, most of our contacts were incorporated there along with some information. I'll talk about that some more. Partner profiles, I think, was an important thing that we included, where we work very closely with a lot of other organizations like National Co-op Grocers and Colluminate and Cooperation Works and various others. So we made sure that I had good profiles of our working relationship, not just who they are and what they do, but this has been our sort of our political connections, the subtle undertones that you might need to be aware of. Same with staff profiles. That was my information transfer about staff, their current roles, how they fit in, where there might be issues, not the conversations that would also occur directly with staff. And again, the board, I got to tell all the trash about the board for the first time ever. It was great. Actually, there was very little to tell. We have a really good professional board representing a lot of very strong co-op organizations. So that was kind of fun to do, actually. I shared our calendar, which is, we have a lot of recurring events. We have a lot of special events. I shared our policies, and that goes from, the board policies with a version of which resemble in some ways Carver policy governance, but we're not actually using Carver policy governance. In other words, we have board policies, we have policies for the executive director, and we have the equivalent of ends policies. So all of that, plus there's the human resources, et cetera, et cetera. Financial management, again, we contracted with an outside organization, Wagner CPAs, to do a lot of our bookkeeping and do our statements. But the in-house, everything that was done in-house was pretty much done by me. And that includes the HR function, managing grants, reporting grants, all of that. So all of that had to be at least outlined, and where possible documented in electronic or paper. Almost everything's electronic, but yeah. Okay, next. So data management. And that overlaps, of course, with information transfer. But address changes, oh my God, that's hard. And again, if you've got somebody on staff that's helping do this sort of thing, all the better for you. But you've got all your vendors, you've got all the people you work with. Now that we can send them email, newsletter, updates, Facebook posts till the world changes, which we hope will happen soon. But they may or may not ever read them or pay attention to them. But you've got a lot of venues to make these address changes known to the world. You've got to think about your website and all of the documents that you ever posted that tell people to go to a certain address or a phone number. If that isn't an organizational address or phone number, then it's going to have to be changed. And because the organizational address was my home address, since we do not have a real address anywhere, it's all virtual, that had to be changed on everything that was out there. And probably still hasn't been entirely, but it's a work in progress. Clearly, our partners, any publications that we've done that have old addresses, it's just a lot. And then website access. Well, you're using several different web services, and all of those have to be changed to give administrative access to a new person, if indeed that administrative access was your departing ED, which in our case it was. So that was more complicated than expected. A lot of times we'd used our web designer or an IT consultant to help us do some of this stuff, and sometimes it hadn't been documented very well. So finding where we even had to go to make some of these changes was the first step, and then getting Bay set up to have full access was another thing. And then finally, we use a Civvy CRM open source database, which was the core of our information center. And the ED has to understand at least the basics of how it's put together and how to use it. We did have written documentation for that, among other things, but it's also one of the most, it has a learning curve. Any new database user will find that, I'm sure. One of the things that's very valuable, and this is a best practice I want to point out, is I started a database. Originally, it was in Access to maintain records of the co-ops we were working with almost from day one. And that is so, so valuable to have those records going back, and you can see when co-ops started, what their addresses, their connections, the conversations you've had, which programs of yours they participated in. Ours aren't perfect. Our records aren't perfect by any means, but once we implemented the Civi database, it started getting better and better, and it's a lot of information that's captured there that can include an awful lot depending on how sophisticated your database is. It is a one way to really help with data transfer when the time comes, because you don't have to do anything except give a new person access. Okay, next. So the other big piece of information transfer, of course, is the thoughtful part, not the data part. A little organizational history. How did we get where we are? Why does that matter? What are our current strategic plans? And as we pointed out earlier, we were on the verge of creating new ones. So they were a little old, but they were what we were working under. And as anybody that's getting RCDG knows, half of your strategic plan is following what you said you'd do for RCDG, and it limits some of that creativity and flexibility in ways that take a little extra effort to figure out. And for an organization like ours, it's trying to help both urban and rural on a roughly 50-50 basis. That becomes even more complex. Explaining our commitments with partners, in other words, the programs we co-hosted, co-shared, where we worked together, where we had problems. There's a lot of that. As I said, we've had very close working relationships with several other co-op organizations. And finally, the commitments we've already made to grants, both RCDG and a few others in our case, where we had projects or expectations or reporting requirements that had to be followed up on. I just want to throw a shout out to Faye that she took over the RCDG grant writing in her first year, and I think she only sent me 1 or 2 questions about the whole process. I was very impressed with that. Okay, next. And then, inevitable, everybody's favorite thing. There were so many meetings, because a lot of what we do, all of the staff are in different locations, almost all of the board are in different locations, and almost none of them are in never the twain shall meet. So we're used to doing a lot of Zoom meetings and whatever, and there were a lot that were involved in this process. Obviously, the new ED needed to be introduced and have time to chat just on the introductory level with the staff board. And we made a special effort to get appointments with our key donors and key working partners, and so that I could introduce Faye personally and they could have a little chat to make sure they understood how important they are to our organization, and to give Faye that chance to get a working head start. And then there were the much more extensive discussions with staff, which was mostly between Faye and the staff. I was not much of a part of any of that, other than their ongoing staff meetings during the time of transition. And then there was the formal onboarding process, which required me to meet with Faye regularly, both Zoom and email and whatever, and one live meeting. Fortunately, we were able to get together for a couple of days and sit down in front of a computer and talk a lot about the kinds of things that you don't think about unless you're sitting down over coffee face to face. Very valuable. Some organizations that might be easier than ours, but it involved her traveling from New England to Minnesota. But it was important. And then there's the follow-up and troubleshooting. All of the things that we tried to have ready in advance and all set up. There were a lot of gaps, especially when it came to web-based transitions. I think that was probably the weakest area. And there was a lot of follow-up on, hey, I need a password, or hey, you're about to get a confirmation text number that I need, or whatever that was. That was the most obvious follow-up and troubleshooting bit. As far as the transition of managing staff, managing finances, working with the board, I think that went remarkably well. And I hope that we can credit the thoughtful onboarding process. I know we can credit exceptional people on both the board and the incoming ED. If there's one thing a board can do to make a transition is go as smoothly as possible and be as happy as possible with the result, it's hire the right ED. And they did that. So next slide.
Well, that's a nice transition. Thanks, Stuart.
You're very welcome.
So I'm Faye Mack. I use she, her pronouns, and I am the incoming ED. And so there's not much more of like the process to share, but we thought it'd be helpful just to share a couple of parts of the, sort of what I found really important about the practice that Richard and Stuart just walked through. And so as was named, I had about 6 weeks with like holidays. End of year is both a great and weird time of year to transition. I'll just say it's nice because things are a little bit slow. Like I didn't come in right in the middle of conference planning or something like that. And there's a lot of financial wrap up at that time of year, which is helpful for learning the finances. But also there's a lot of holidays and vacations to navigate. So in that period, you know, Stuart and I had a solid kind of 5 weeks together. And I'd say that was about the right time. I think toward the end, if I remember, we both were kind of running out of things to do together and kind of like, who should do this? Should you do this or I should do this? Like it started to get like, okay, now it felt like it was the time. But it was enough time to have had a lot of conversation. And that was a lot of what I found really valuable about the process. There is space and ability to observe and kind of experience the organization and experience relationships and get to see sort of dynamics and what staff meetings were like and just sort of be in it and get a sense of things. And that ability the ability to have overlap, to be able to experience that was really valuable. Because I wasn't coming from that community, you know, I've experienced ED transition before, not as the executive director, but as a program director, and it was an internal candidate. And so the transition was really different because everybody already knew each other. And I think in this instance, being able to come in and just spend some time getting to know people and just seeing how things flow and what the vibe is like really actually made a huge difference. The other big piece that was really helpful was having that space for big conversations and going out to Minnesota, having a chance to just have like big freewheeling, you know, what's this partner relationship like? And did you guys ever think about doing this? And just being able to kind of get the backstory and the context for things helped set me up to sort of know the environment a little bit better, to know what kind of relationships I was walking into. And also helped set us up, I think, for strategic planning, and that I got to kind of glean like, well, have you ever thought about doing things this way? Or, you know, why are things this way, to like get into the whys. And that was far and away much more valuable than the how-tos. The how-tos are important, but being able to experience and have those conversations really helpful. And then the other really big piece, I would say, were those introduction meetings. So Stuart organized a lot of one-on-one meetings with, you know, the person who helps us with our website, but also with the, you know, head of the National Co-op Grocers and with Alex and, you know, other key partners that allowed, it both gave me an introduction so that later in like February, when I wanted to reach out to them, I had some context. They had met me, they knew who I was, but it also was, I think, a very valuable sort of signal and handoff in relationships that Stuart had cultivated for many years by having that meeting together that allowed sort of the sense of like, I approve of her, you should keep working with her. And it was a really valuable way to transition a relationship by it kind of gave a stamp of approval. I wasn't just cold calling, you know, 5 weeks into my job. I had kind of that meeting where we got to talk about the history of the relationship and what was coming up. And And then allowed me to, in the next, over the next 6 months, have another meeting to sort of start my own kind of relationship with all of these people. And that transition was really helpful. It was that kind of soft stuff, I think, were the pieces that were really valuable in having an overlap, and where I think if it's possible to have some sort of overlap, it's not too long, but also not too short. That kind of 4-week period feels like a really nice length of time of overlap to be able to hit some of that stuff, and not just here's the password to our checking account and here's how you run payroll, which was also really important training. And so I also wanted to just touch a little bit on what happened after Stuart left. So Stuart left at the end of 2022. And while there are still some things that feel like a transition, that first quarter especially was a big transition. I had my first board meeting solo. I had my first couple of trips and in-person meetings with people solo, although I didn't actually meet the FCI staff in person until September of 2023 at our up and coming conference, and most of the board too, but I did get to meet some other folks in person. And so in that quarter, it's still a big piece of the transition. And there were some things that really stood out to me about that. And one of those was that Stuart was still accessible, which isn't always the case. And like Stuart alluded to, we had a lot of continued conversation, particularly around administration. And especially with two-factor authentication, it's very hard to change passwords and get access. And there was only so much of that we had time to do before he left. And so having access to that was really important. I think there are ways to maybe plan ahead and work around that so that you don't need to do that. Like, we're in different time zones. It was a lot of texting saying, are you around? I need you to get a code from your cell phone. But I think it's also inevitable for small organizations like ours, especially with a founding executive director, because like Stuart said, he was the only staff member for a long time. So a lot of personal and professional get intertwined, right? And so nobody in our office has a work cell phone. Like, we use our personal cell phones as our phone numbers. So for any kind of two-factor authentication, it's our personal cell phone. There isn't really a way to transfer that number. Our office address has always been someone's home address. I opted for a PO box, which is slightly different, but still would need to change if we ever hired another executive director that didn't live in the same rural town in Vermont that I live in. And so that process took a lot, and it was really helpful to have somebody who was still willing to be around and available. And there were some why questions too. There were a couple questions around RCDG and just especially around data. Like, in a small organization, there's also not a lot of duplication. And so things like processing data and knowing about our impact, that was all stuff that Stuart ran. And so other staff didn't always know, like, oh yeah, that's how we get that number. And those were things that didn't always have great documentation. So it was really helpful to be able to go back and ask that. But I do think that those are things that you can also kind of make sure you get written down ahead of time too. Another big piece about sort of that first quarter, and really that whole first year, is to remember that, especially in a small organization, especially an organization that doesn't have a lot of turnover, it was a huge transition for staff. We had 2 staff members at the time, in addition to the executive director. The last staff member had been hired in 2018. So it's not an organization that's constantly saying goodbye and onboarding people, and there's just a few people. So all the dynamics shifted. Stuart and I are different people, right? And we have different leadership styles and approaches to things. And just when you replace 1/3 of the staff, the culture of the staff shifts, right? And so recognizing that is going to take a lot of time to develop new supervision relationships, new leadership styles, granting grace on both sides, and just recognizing that you're building trust over time. And it takes a little bit there's a runway there. I think, things really felt like they clicked after, a few months. We started to really get in a good flow of things. And then they really started to click, I would say, around 6 to 9 months after the transition. of feeling like, oh, we're like a well-oiled machine. We know how each other thinks and we know how each other processes information. So we know how to tell each other things in a way that actually works. It took a little while to get there. And then the other piece is just to know that like, there's no way to prepare for everything. And there are always going to be some gaps in understanding. There might be some kind of black holes of like, I don't know about the history of that grant or that organization or that, whatever happened to that project. And that's okay. I think that's just part of it. But there always will be some things, and there'll always be things that you didn't train for or didn't realize that there was a renewing subscription that happened 8 months after the transition that suddenly appears on the credit card statement. Like there's just like things, right, that are going to come up and there's no way to account for all of them. And so perfection is not the goal there. The other piece too, I would just add is that I think, as folks mentioned, we entered into a formal strategic planning process in my first year. That could be a whole other webinar. I think there's a lot of pros and cons to doing that. But it did mean that we really hit the ground running in the year and had kind of big projects and big thoughts to take on, as opposed to kind of entering in like year 4 or 5 of a strategic plan where you're kind of fulfilling, you have a path forward, the work plan feels really clear, you kind of know what's coming up for a couple of years and can settle in. And in a way, it was really great. It allowed us to step back and have reflection space and allowed me as a new director to mold the organization a little bit. There was sort of an opening for change, like it was expected. So I wasn't pushing up against hard lines that I didn't know existed. There was sort of like, we're expecting change, or we're expecting to ask questions this year, which was also really helpful. And so I think I've shared some reflections throughout, and we'll open up for lots of good conversation around reflections, but wanted to share, we're kind of creating a Google Doc all together about sort of what were the best practices that we would tell everybody, and what were some of the things we would do different, what are those reflections? And I was looking through those and really felt like actually one of the biggest reflection or the biggest sort of takeaways beyond the nitty-gritty kind of logistics are the ways that FCI approached the transition. That, I just give great applause to the board and staff at the time for how they approached it, because I think it's really about how you enter into the situation is how successful you will be in having a transition. And there were kind of 3 pieces of that in my mind. There was that the board and the executive director had a really strong partnership already. There was a transparent relationship, there was trust. As Stuart said, he had kind of already hinted and talked at the fact that his retirement was looming at some point soon, and he gave a long runway, right? So nothing was a surprise. The board wasn't blindsided with 2 weeks to figure something out. It was an amicable departure, which, you can't always guarantee. And everybody was ready to engage in the full process, which is a long process. Even, this was a 9-month and really, I'd say a year-long process, including that kind of post-transition quarter. People were ready to dig in and engage and be present through that. They did a really nice job of thinking about how staff could be engaged without burdening staff with managing the process or logistics in a way that, would have been hard for them. So that piece of how they work together, I think, was really important. The other is prepare, as we keep talking about, creating that onboarding plan, having documents, having those meetings, feeling like you're kind of going overboard with silly Word docs about how to, with all the different steps, really actually made a big difference. I would say, and I think we've all said that this is probably the area where we struggled the most. I don't know if these people exist, but I think they do. I would imagine that if there's a budget to bring somebody in that transition time who can help organize your Google Drive folders or your Dropbox folders, who can help make sure that that things are organized, that you have the documents that you need, that you know, like we had something come up when I tried to change bank accounts because our checking account was in a Minnesota-based bank. And so we moved to a credit union in the Northeast, and we couldn't actually close the account because nobody was the account signer, because the account signers were old board members from, who had retired years before, and it just had never gotten updated because those things happen, right? And so having somebody who could like come in and do like almost like a forensics of like, here's what you need to update, here's your passwords here, and try to get that in order, I think would be money really well spent. Because as Stuart said, it's a huge load on the executive director, who still has to manage all of their daily workload also. So that would be maybe something to recommend.
There,
And then
I know that
oh.
they, at one time, there was at least one consultant at Illuminate that would do an administrative survey to check to see that everything was as it should be. I don't know if that included actually creating documents that were needed, but so that there may be people out there that can do that work.
Yeah. It's like a closet organizer for your files.
Yeah.
And then the final thing is that there was a lot of trust and grace given to me, which was really helpful. I think it's really hard, especially when, I haven't been an outgoing founding executive director, but I imagine that it's your baby. It's very hard to let go of and to walk away from and to let someone else take the reins on, even if you're ready. And I'm sure there have been moments where Stuart has been like, what is she doing? That is a weird post, or, who knows, but I haven't heard that, and that's good. I shouldn't hear that. And so, Stuart has done a really nice job of giving space, of cheerleading me and cheerleading the organization, from, sending little notes to us on staff saying like, loved your newsletter, it looked really great, but also, out in the community and cheerleading the direction the FCI is going in. And, offering opinions when asked. We've consulted with Stuart on a few things, and that's been really helpful. But there's just been space and grace given and trust that we're heading in the right direction. And that's been really valuable, to be able to allow me to come in and stand in my power and my space, and really be able to lead the organization forward. And I think similarly, the board has been just really trusting of process, and that some changes were made really quickly, or things were adjusted quickly because they needed to be, or, it fit better that way. And some were saying, you know what, I'm not going to adjust the format of this report this year because I don't have the brain space for it, but I do think next year I will, and letting that be okay. And knowing that some things will change over time. Some things will change quickly. Some things don't need to change at all, of course. But to really trust and allow for me to have opinions from day one, right? These are also people who have been engaged with the organization for a really long time. And there just has been a lot of trust and grace. And I think that that's really important as well. I had, in another leadership transition I had been part of, our outgoing executive director on the last day gave this whole thing where she said, I love you, and you all will not see me for a while. I'm not going to show up to your fundraising events. it was an in-person organization, but she was like, I'm not going to show up at the State House with you. It doesn't mean I don't think you're all doing a great job, but you all need to be able to stand without me or my shadow. And so know that I'm cheerleading you. And I remember as a staff member being really sad about that. And now I realize what a powerful and generous thing that was. And Stuart's done a lot of that same space. And so that's been really great too. And that's it for our prepared remarks. Stuart and Richard, are there any like high level things that I missed and kind of reflections that you want to share before we open it up?
I have a high level reflection that we talked about a little bit, but never made it into the slides. Some of you might wonder, that we didn't have an internal candidate or an internal succession plan in place. Yeah, Cindy's got her thumb up. Well, we sort of did. I'd been working with one of our staff over time. At one point, she had been they had been very interested in that change and having an opportunity to lead the organization. But life changes, and as the time approached for the transition, I had very serious conversations with them, and at that point, it wasn't a good fit. So we knew we had a very strong person still in the organization that could help make the transition smoother regardless. But it didn't work out. And then again, it can be hard to find a succession plan when you've only got 3 people. You've only got 2 to work with, and if chances are you're going to be lucky if one of them is a good fit for it. So it can't always be the case, but I think you can, regardless, prepare the staff you have to be as well informed and if you get run over by the proverbial bus or bicycle, since we're co-ops, you still want the organization to be able to run smoothly, and that's true with or without an ED position ready to be filled. So don't forget about it, even if you can't get the perfect plan in place.
I guess one thing I would add, and this isn't, this is, I guess, a governance best practice, is it's really helpful to have folks on your board who have had experience or who are experts in organizational planning, in HR and operations. We had quite a few folks on the board that happen to be experts in organizational governance and operations, and we're able to really help shepherd the process and offer really valuable input and assets as we went through the process.
And that was a conscious effort of the board to develop that strength internally, to be as representative as possible, to include people from different backgrounds, different organizations that were supportive and could complement the work of FCI, and as diverse as possible as well. So, I mean, I think during the time I was there, there have been dramatic changes in the board, all for the better. And I think that just kudos for what that work they did.
Well, I think we have a little bit of time for Q&A coming to the last chunk of this webinar, and I see that Cindy has her hand up. So if our panelists are ready for some Q&A from the audience, I think we can move into that.
Fire away.
So Stuart answered my first question. Thank you. So my second question, which kind of tags on to that, and I think maybe this is more a question for you, Faye. What are you doing different now to prepare for the next transition? Not that we're planning on you leaving soon, but are there things you're putting in place so you're ready for the next time you have a transition in an ED?
Yeah, that's a really good question. There's a lot I should be doing, and maybe I'm not. I mean, I think that one of the things that we've done over the last year and a half is just bring more systems into place, and de-silo the staff. So that's something that I think would help if I were to get run over by the bicycle, or if there was a sudden transition, is that staff are there's more interaction, understanding of each other's work and roles and collaboration. I think, although there was already a high level of that beforehand, but we've like really systematized a lot of that. We've done a fair amount of work on like our database and administrative things. I think a lot of that has been streamlined in the last year and a half. There's more I would like to do, and to really get our files and our records really, really organized, and to write out how things are done. I mean, I will say right now, if I were to like, if I were to leave right now, nobody knows how to run payroll. And nobody else has authorization to run payroll. Somebody could figure out how to make it happen, but there isn't, because we're such a small staff, and right now we're a staff of 2, it's just JQ and I. And so there really is an ability. I think it's one of the downfalls of having a small organization, or one of the hard parts about having a small organization, is you can't be completely duplicative. Everybody can't be cross-trained in everything. Otherwise you wouldn't get anything done. But I do think there's been, one of my goals has really been to just de-silo things, help the board. I think the board feels more aware perhaps of ongoing. I do a monthly update to the board in addition to our quarterly meetings, so they have a better sense of what's going on. So there's that. And we also now have a written strategic plan. So that is one thing that we do have as a really strong guiding document around where the organization is heading for the next 5 years. So it would, if somebody were to come in now, they obviously could, make changes, but there would be sort of like a path forward.
Thanks for that, Faye. We have some time for some other questions, if anybody else has anything. You can feel free to come off mute or to just drop it in the chat.
I have a question. There was some conversation about how you've extended the application process when it felt like you didn't kind of have a diverse group of applicants. What were your strategies to what strategies did you use to kind of reach other populations, or kind of just that diversity of applicants?
Thanks for the question, Sandra. So I would say primarily 2 things. One was, as Faye had mentioned earlier, we added language to the job announcement to try to make it clear that we were looking for people of diverse backgrounds, of different. I guess what else did we say in that additional language? I guess we just kind of made it clear we're looking for folks that are passionate about building democracy, creating more just food systems, and it was just language that I think probably would appeal to an even broader pool of candidates. And then the other thing was we asked NCBA to try to send it out to new networks more broadly. And up until then, we had only shared it, or NCBA had only shared it through some kind of closed networks. And then after that, they shared it through Indeed, which went out to a much broader audience.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
And were there any specific specific communities that you kind of outreach to, or was it just kind of using those specific?
Well, we did ask board members to try to find new networks to share it with, or try to resend it to folks they may have sent it to initially, but get them to think about it again. I see the question from Thomas too. What kind of candidates did we get through Indeed? We did get at least one candidate that really was an unexpected, was coming from a completely unexpected background. So if we also got a lot of applications from folks that we suspected were just kind of sending it out to anyone and everyone. But we did get at least one new applicant that was seriously considered that we would not have received had we just used the same networks we were using before then.
I see. Thank you.
I'm really curious about the types of qualifications you were looking for. You know, like, I think broadening it out to people who don't have co-op experience is really important, given that it's like kind of a pretty small world. So yeah, I'd love to hear more about, you know, what you did emphasize instead of that.
Well, we did have in the job announcement, and it was certainly an important criterion that we used in the interview process, that one at least understood cooperatives and you know, the cooperative principles. It wasn't a requirement, so we did try to reach beyond that, but certainly understanding of co-ops and positive feeling about co-ops was still an important criterion. We were also looking, though, for someone who had experience and expertise in organizational management beyond cooperatives, specifically community and economic development, and we were looking for other leadership traits that you know that could certainly that we needed to see, you know, balancing out some of the other experience we were looking for. So let's see, I'm trying to remember what else. Leadership, it was experience and expertise in cooperatives and community and economic development. And I think we were also looking for someone who had understanding or experience in finances, organizational finances, in advocacy. So yeah, we were trying to look at the full range of functions for the ED, and trying to see folks that had that background.
I think too, just in thinking about the interview question, some of the conversation that felt important in the interview, it was, in addition to what Richard said, there was a lot of conversation about strategic planning. And like, the board was really clear, like, we want you to take that on in your first year, a formal strategic planning process with a consultant. Are you able to do that? So that was a really clear piece of it.
Indeed.
And there was some really great conversation with around how to approach leadership and program work and organization with an equity lens, and how to navigate you know, different communities. FCI is national, works with rural communities, urban communities, has a very strong relationship with the Black-led startup food co-op community. You know, so there was a lot of conversation around that. And in particular, I just remember a really nice conversation around, like, what happens when you say the wrong thing or you mess up? Like, how do you deal with that? Which was a really nice conversation, and I appreciated as a candidate, you know, the ability to kind of talk about that too. But those pieces were really present too, just around and around kind of, you know, how do you work with staff? How do you work on organizational culture and those pieces as well?
So I see a question has come in through the chat from Blake, who's thanking all of you for the great presentation, and then asking, I'm curious if this transition process has informed how FCI anticipates other transitions within the organization, i.e. board member onboarding or exiting?
Yeah, that's a good question.
Yeah.
I certainly from a board member point of view, we right after we hired Faye, we did bring on 2 new board members. And I would say during that process, we certainly, we're thinking about traits that we wanted to fill in on the board that I think probably came out during that whole process that we were maybe missing. So I would say it informed us during that process that was going on at the same time. We have not brought on a new board member since the beginning of 2023 now. So I'm not sure how it might impact our thinking going forward.
I'll add, so I, in my previous role, have onboarded and hired, I don't know, 15, 20 people. And that was it was a, organization of 16. And so, so I have so I don't know how much of it is that the way the FCI has approached transition or how I've approached transition in the past, but I do think that it's really present. So we had a staff member leave at the end of April for a new opportunity and had a lot of conversation about whether or not to hire right away, and decided not to. So we're hoping to hire maybe later this fall. And in part because we weren't quite sure what we needed to hire for, which is a really good thing to reflect on. We knew that we didn't want to replace that exact position. And so we needed a little space to be able to reflect on that. And also one of the things that we felt really present to as a staff of 2 with our national conference coming up and summer vacations and all of that was that we didn't have the space to hire well and to do the process with integrity, especially with an equity lens, and to be the kind of organization that could welcome someone in newly, especially who didn't come necessarily from the co-op community or who was it, and all of that. And especially around onboarding. We're like, we don't have the space to do the organizational culture right, in terms of bringing somebody on, welcoming them in, and not just saying, oh my God, thank God, another body, here's a fire hose, which is where we would be right now if we were bringing somebody on. And so we chose to pause, mostly because I don't think we would have brought somebody on in a way that would have led to a sustainable hire or a good experience. And making the space for that. And I think hiring well, and this is something, with a long runway that FCI had for the ED hire and other ways around the onboarding, is that to do it well takes time, takes space, especially in a small organization where there is no HR person or person who can manage, it's like 2 of us trying to figure that out. And so I think that informs that process and will help inform what an actual onboarding process for a new staff person looks like too.
Thanks so much for sharing back on that. If folks do have any more questions, I think we have time for probably 1 or 2 more. And I'm sure all of these folks will be available for an email question if something pops up a little later. Their slides have their contact information, so feel free to reach out then as well. I'll give them 1 more pause to see if anybody else wants to chime in with something. All right, people feel.
Great presentation, you guys. That was awesome. Thank you.
Yeah,
Thank you.
thanks
you.
very
Good.
much to Stuart, Richard, and Faye for sharing these really wonderful lessons. And I think Stuart was going to also share the onboarding plan, some documents that I can share out with. Was that accurate, Stuart?
That was what we were talking about, yeah.
Great. So I will get this recording up so folks can definitely come back and review it. And yeah, thanks so much to FCI for being the first organization in this webinar series and putting together such a thoughtful process and being able to share out lessons learned about that. Just great appreciation for all three of you. And we'll keep everyone informed of when the next webinar happens, which we're hoping could be by the end of next month or so. So thank you so much and stay tuned, and we'll see you all soon.
Thank you, Alex, for
Go
organizing.
co-op,
Great.
and don't forget to vote.
Oh, yeah.
Thanks, Alex.
Bye-bye.